Welcome to ArcGIS Online, Web Mapping with Arcade Expressions. My name is Paul Barker. I'm a product engineer on the ArcGIS Online team, and I work across a variety of different features within ArcGIS Online. I'm joined by my colleague Lisa Berry, who's also a product engineer, and she works on the Living Atlas team and is responsible for creating great content for you guys to use that's ready out of the box. All right, let's dive in. Let's take a quick look at the agenda today. We'll talk really quick about Arcade and what it is. For those of you that haven't had a chance to use it yet, we're going to really discuss on why you might want to use Arcade, where you're going to find the ability to use Arcade, and then we're going to go through a series of demos showcasing the different areas that you can use Arcade in, and we're going to ramp up that complexity as we go along. And then finally, we're going to give you a brief overview on testing and performance considerations, and then touch really quick on what's next and leave you with a few places to go looking for resources and help should you need it. So let's talk about what Arcade is. It's named after the Arch, not the Pac-Man arcades. Esri has kind of a long history of naming things after architecture, and this kind of goes back to those early roots, much the same way that Avenue does. It is a lightweight expression language. It is not a fully scripting language. The intention here is to have a GIS-aware expression language that you can work with and manipulate data. We've tried to kind of model the syntax and functions very similar to JavaScript and Excel for increased familiarity. And the idea here is that you can take Arcade and it's portable across ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Online, the runtime SDKs, JavaScript, as well as the different web apps. And what I mean by portable is that you can write the expression and have it reliably run in all these different environments. So that compatibility is really important. There are some nuances there that you need to keep in mind when you're working with different versions of Pro, older versions of the runtime apps and Enterprise. As Arcade evolves and as we add new functionality, obviously those functions don't work in older versions. But if you go to the developer site, we've got a really handy matrix there in the Arcade documentation that kind of helps you understand what versions of Enterprise and Online and Pro different functions were added to give you some strategies. And we're going to actually do some work in the editor in the future to let you know what the minimum version needed to run this expression is when you're writing it, so you just get a better visibility into compatibility. But generally speaking, it's compatible in cross-platform and portable. And I just want to touch really quick that this is not a replacement for Python or geoprocessing. Arcade is really lightweight for on-the-fly manipulation, as well as kind of an interoperability language, whereas Python is really a robust programming language, and the geoprocessing is built on that. While they'll have some similarities in terms of what they can do at a basic level, they are really not the same thing. And at no point is Arcade going to replace Python and geoprocessing. So, what can it do and what is it? So, it's essentially, like most expression languages, it calculates something. So, that could be really simple or it could be really complex. And it's driven by your data. So you can look at the values in your feature and maybe sum them to create a new virtual attribute. You might go out in a really complicated scenario and query another layer and say, hey, I want to know all of the values within this polygon, and then do something with it after that. It can be an alternative to calculating a new field. If you own the data, calculating a field is going to give you the best performance, but you don't always own the data, and sometimes those values are changing so constantly that it doesn't make sense to calc a field. And we'll touch on that in the context of attribute rules just a little bit later. And before I ramble on too long, I think I'm going to hand you over to Lisa, who's going to take you through the next few stages of this presentation.
So now that you've learned what Arcade is, you might be wondering, why would I use it? Arcade is really powerful because it moves us away from traditional workflows where if you forgot to add a field or if your field type was wrong or if you didn't even own the data, it used to be this process where you had to go back 5 steps before you could start to move forward. But with Arcade, you're able to easily get started, especially if you already have JavaScript or coding knowledge, um, and able to allow you to calculate new things that may have been forgotten or don't even exist within your data. But also it helps anyone who isn't a scripter. You can do things as easy as adding 2 things together. As Paul mentioned, these expressions also carry through downstream applications, which is really helpful because if you create something in a web map, your app's downstream will honor those arcade expressions. It's also built to be secure, and it's also geospatial, as Paul mentioned, as we'll be showing in some of our demos in just a minute. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it can be really simple, but it's also really powerful. It has this Excel-like structure that lets you just kind of use built-in functions or write basic equations. You can even reuse some of your existing expressions. But this is all super powerful because of the fact that you can use it throughout your map. You can use it to do some of these examples that you see here. And really, you can find it throughout the map. You can find it in symbology, transparency, pop-ups, rotations, labels, etc. And the nice thing about this is your web map is your container for all these things. So it's easy to make quick adjustments. And as long as you're calling to a web map ID, your app will automatically absorb all these changes done in your web map. And so it's just easy to go back to your web map, which stores all of that, and make quick adjustments. And just a quick intro, I'll show you real quick. This is what the expression window looks like. And so this section, the box in the middle where it has the equation, that's where you will write your equation. That's your expression. And you also have access over here on the right to globals, so the things within your web map, within your layer, things like the fields and whatnot, the features themselves. You have built-in functions with built-in help. You have some constant variables that you can use in order to calculate new things or format your text. And once you've created an expression within a web map, you can actually reuse it if it exists within a layer, which helps you avoid having to redo the same thing over and over and over. And we really encourage you to also test your functions or your expressions, because it's easy to write something and think it'll just work. But as programmers and developers, we know that that's not always the case. So this blue test button really is super valuable for helping you make sure that what your expression is returning is what you're expecting, because the web map will absorb whatever this expression returns. And so, for example, this one's returning a number, so the web map will treat that like any other field that's a number. And now Paul's going to get a little bit more into the complex parts of arcade expressions and some of the capabilities that are available within it.
Thanks for that, Lisa. So let's start talking a little bit more about some of the more complicated scenarios. As you evolve your script, you might suddenly need to kind of augment just simple kind of attribute combination and things like that. And Arcade does have some basics here to help get you started. So, you can declare variables. You can actually declare your own functions if you intend to reuse them in multiple places. And that's sometimes handy for code readability and troubleshooting too, by not having the same code duplicated multiple places. If there's bugs, you only got to fix it once. This is an area we're trying to do some more exploratory work. We've heard from a lot of customers that it would be really nice to actually reuse functions, but also reuse them in a broad context, not just within a single arcade expression, but be able to have your own library of functions that you import maybe into a map to use, so that you can, similar to how you would factor that out into a function in a single expression for efficiency, if you're doing the same expression in multiple maps, as you evolve that function, it'd be really nice if you could just update it in one central place and it trickles through every map that references it. So that's something we're looking at. Can't make any promises yet, but we do hear that a lot, and it's an active area of kind of exploration for us. There's a lot of flow control here with conditional logic, for loops, and as you start to kind of build more complex expressions, I think we're GIS folks. We love geography here. You're going to want to kind of pull in geometry functions and look at spatial relationships between different data sets and different layers and features. So that's an example of adding more complexity. And then last but not least, we've got feature sets. And feature sets, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the next slide. Feature sets are really just a collection of features, and being able to get where you define and get those, I'll clarify a little bit later. So some classic examples that we've seen users use for pop-ups. So being able to pull in related record data into the parent's pop-up. So maybe I want to click on a hydrant and I want to know when the last inspection was for a particular hydrant, and I can pull that in from the inspection table by saying, give me all of the inspections, sort them by descending date, give me the first feature from the related record table. So the other one is, we could use field calculate and do some rendering based on geographic relationships. I say field calculate here because we get this question a lot. People would love to use feature sets to do on-the-fly rendering. A classic one is I want to label or I want to visualize my symbology based on related records. I hear you. I do too. That would be super cool and exciting, but unfortunately the performance is just not realistic there. So for things like that, if you wanted to visualize based on an attribute in related records, what we would encourage you to do is use a field calculate operation to pull that data into the parent record and then go from there. In the future, attribute rules, which are computed attributes on the server side, will help mitigate that. So you can actually have a system field that updates and recalculates as the data changes, and so that layer or that field value is always current. So that's coming to hosted feature layers. You can see some of that experience in the geodatabase and ArcGIS Pro and stuff today. But let's talk about feature sets next. So, like I said before, feature sets are a way to access information for multiple features, basically. So you define kind of where those features, where you're going to get those features from. In some cases, that's the layer you're working with. In other cases, it may be a layer within the service, such as Dollar Data Store, or they're just another layer in the map. So what you basically do is you define the context by which you're going to, work with the features within. So in the context of a map, I'm going to say I want the layers in my map, and inside the layers in my map, I want urban forestry. And then you define that feature set, and from there you can filter and query and manipulate that data as you need to. You could perform a spatial operation, different things like that. So they're super exciting, and they can be incredibly powerful and rich, but they also still need to be used responsibly. It's a very expensive way of querying data, and by expensive I mean performance. We're sending these queries on the fly. Depending on how large your data is, that the information coming back may be quite large, and it may need all the data before it can perform its calculations. So you really need to play with that and use them sparingly so that you get the most efficiency out of them. If you just pepper your pop-up with feature set based expressions and your data is of any size, substantial size, you're going to slowly hit performance issues where the pop-up isn't responsive while it waits, and it's not going to be a great experience. So just try and use them strategically, and I will talk a little bit more later about things you can do to make them faster. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Lisa, who's going to start showing you some demos. Thanks.
All right, well, I'm going to get us started with some demos. I'm going to first show us where to find Arcade in a few different places within the new map viewer in ArcGIS Online. The one that I use the most commonly is using Arcade for smart mapping, which is how you symbolize your map. So here we see census tracts in the Chicago area of the United States. This is American Community Survey data from the Living Atlas. And once you've selected your layer on this toolbar on the left, you'll have this option on the right to symbolize it within the styles. And usually you would just choose a field from your data, but in this case, I want to use an expression because I want to map a variable that does not exist within my data set. So right away, you can see the expression window, which I introduced a little bit earlier, but this is using a live layer within this map. You can see this is where the variables are under globals. And since I'm using symbology, this profile only allows me to access the $ feature and the scale. So one thing that I like to encourage people first is to name your expressions, because this is what's going to show up throughout your map and within your legend. So I'm going to show the the people that are under 6 in poverty. And you'll notice that I have this field right here, the population whose income is below the poverty level who are under 6, but I want this as a percent. So to use this, this field from my layer, I can go ahead and just click it, and I can build this expression for a percentage just like I would within Excel. So I say this variable divided by this variable, and I would multiply it by 100. And in order to see what result this gives, I can click the test button, and right away I can see this is giving me an example using the first field from my data set, and this is giving me a number. And now that I've calculated my percentage, when I click OK, ArcGIS Online is going to calculate this client side and offer me selections of options for styling the map. I would maybe want to show this by counts and amounts color. And immediately I start to see some patterns emerging within my map. And again, this is where that name of your expression shows up within your legend. And so again, this is why I highly encourage you to always name your expressions. So this is just a really basic example of how we calculated something on the fly using Arcade. Now, how would you use Arcade within labels? Here's an example showing school districts in the Sacramento part of Northern California. Again, if I select this layer on the left, I'll then get all my options on the right, and one of those is labels. So right now it's labeling it based off of a field from my data, but you'll notice these are in all caps. And this is an example where I got the data set from someone else, so I can't control what this data looks like, but I can use an Arcade expression, which we can use with this button right here, in order to adapt to this. So instead of using this name, I'm actually going to use one of the built-in functions this time. There's all sorts of different things that you can do with these functions, but I want to use in particular the proper function, which if you click this I on the right, it actually gives you built-in help right within the interface. And it's telling me if you use the proper function, you give it a value, and you have the option to apply this to either every word or just the first word. So if I wanted to use this function, I could just click it over here in the part on the right, and it automatically puts the syntax into the expression builder over here on the left. So I want to replace this field or value generic term with a field from my data, which is within my globals. I'm going to replace it with this $ feature name. So now when I test this, I'm going to get something beautiful, and I know that it's a string. And again, this is going to calculate this all client side, and boom, my map is now beautifully labeled with a really basic use of functions in Arcade. Let's go ahead and look at one other example. Right now we're seeing bike paths in the Sacramento area by their bike class. And again, this is where this data is actually from an open data site from the city of Sacramento. And they're offering this data as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which to an everyday reader doesn't necessarily make sense. So how could we turn this bike class field into something a little bit more informative to an end reader? you can see that what I did in this example, oh, sorry, bear with me, was that I used an arcade expression for my symbology to simply rename these within the legend, so that now these bike classes have these beautiful informative names that mean something to the map reader. And if we go in, we can look at that expression by clicking on it, and it will open up that expression window. And we can see we set a variable called bike class, which called to that field. And then we used one of the conditional functions, which is called when, in order to specify if it's 0, call it unpaved trail. If it's 1, call it a bike path, etc. And so the when function is a really useful way to create new classifications or handle these different conditional statements. All right, so now that we've seen a few different examples of the basics, how would we go one step further? If we show this bus stops layer, we can now see bus stops and where they align with the bike paths in the city. But I want someone to be able to click on one of these bus stops and see if it's within a quarter mile or half a mile of one of these bike paths. So I've actually already done that. If I click on one of these features, you see this one says there are no dedicated bike paths within a quarter mile of this stop. If I click one that's obviously along a line, it says there's a bike path within a quarter mile of this stop. So how is this done? I want this pop-up to appear on my bus stops layer, so I'll select it over here on the left, and then I'm going to go into the configure pop-ups option. Here's where we build this. So I can manage the expressions within this layer, and you can see I've already built an arcade expression in here that calls to a feature set or a set of features within my map. And in this case, it's those layers of bike paths. I then did a buffer of my feature by a quarter mile, did an intersection of where those buffers fall in relation to the bike paths, and then I did a count. And based off of that count, I used another conditional function called if, where I created text based off of that. So here you can see this is where I built the text that we saw a second ago. So I'm going to real quick show you how you can build one for maybe the count of how many are within a half a mile. So I'm going to name this half a mile from bike paths. And the first thing I want to do is access that other layer within my map. And so I can open up the $sign map to see what other layers are within my map. And if I just click this feature set by name, it'll actually add it directly within my map. This is a layer, and I just added it straight into my statement. So if I said return FS and click test, it would grab me every single feature as a feature set. Now this is not useful for a pop-up, and so how could this is where I kind of just start to build. This is how I play. I use this return statement in order to tell my expression to return me something. So I now want to buffer my bus stops. And so I'm going to go ahead and find the buffer geodetic function, click that, and I'm going to buffer my feature by 0.5 miles. So now if I said return that buffer, it's telling me it's returning a polygon. I now want to see where that intersects with my feature set, my set of bike paths. So I could use the intersects function, and instead of $feature, I want to see where my buffers intersect that set of features. So now when I return this, I can see it's only returning the ones that are intersecting that buffer, and it's giving me a feature set. So instead of giving me a feature set, which is not something a pop-up can absorb, I'm actually going to tell it to return the count of those intersections. And so now, if I tell it to count how many are there, it's giving me a number. Now this is something I could use within my pop-up and create instead of using a statement, I could say there are 8 stops within a half mile of this bike path. So those are just some basic examples of using feature sets and getting started with Arcade. Now, Paul is going to show you how to go one step further and do some more advanced things with Arcade.
All right, thanks, Lisa. All right, let's dive into some more examples. So I'm going to take you through a couple just quick simple ones around data cleanup and just building some dynamic URLs in the pop-up. So what you can see here is I've got existing wells, and they're color-coded by depth to bedrock. In this data set, it's unclear just by looking at it whether or not what the values mean. So we're going to use Arcade to kind of tidy things up and provide some more information. So if we look at the pop-up right now, we'll see that depth to bedrock is not recorded, static level is not recorded for this one, and there's a link to a PDF log. These are all driven by Arcade, and what we're doing basically is tidying up the data on the fly using just some simple conditional logic. So let's go into the pop-up and take a quick look. So pull up the pop-up, go into Manage Expressions, and I can see I've got 3 expressions. So let's try and just find one really quick here. And it's got data, so clearly not very many people in this area were recording depth to bedrock. Here's a great one. All right, so we've got a few things going on here. So let's take a look at the depth to bedrock expression. I happen to know that when the value is 0 for depth to bedrock, that actually means not recorded versus the bedrock is at surface. So what I've done here is just used a simple if expression, and I've said basically if the depth to bedrock equals 0, we return not recorded. Otherwise, return the depth to bedrock and the value. So if we test that, we'll see that we get not recorded with our test feature. But if we look at the map too, it's pretty messy. For some reason, static water level isn't like that either. So let's take a look. Static water level is exactly the same. The only difference is we've broken it out here just to make it a little more readable, and basically the same pattern. We've said if the static water level is 0, then return not recorded. Otherwise, return the static water level. And what we're going to do on the fly is round that to 2 decimal places, just to tidy it up. And we're appending the unit of measure, so there's no ambiguity about what is actually being measured here. And last but not least, and I think one of the more interesting ones, is this PDF drill log. So if we were to look at that in the paper well logs, which is the first expression in my list, we're actually taking the well ID and manipulating it a little bit. The paper well logs for this data set are available through a well-known URL and then a specific URL pattern, which is the first 3 digits of the well ID followed by the full well ID.pdf. So if we test this, we're actually going to see, oh yeah, we've got a URL here. And it substitutes that on the fly, and if we click more information here, we'll see if we can get the results. So here we have it. We're pulling in the original well log. You can see how messy that data collection is in the field. That's pretty typical, but still useful information if you're looking at the data and trying to figure out whether there's errors and different things like that. So that's a really simple use case for Arcade. And let's take a look at one more really quick one that I think is quite interesting. This was written by a colleague of mine, Doug Morgenthaler, on the collector team. And he has pulled together a really interesting data set where the pop-up is actually calculating values on the fly for requirements for flood mitigation and planning. So if we go in here, you can see sand needed, sandbags needed, and polyurethane sheet whether it's needed or not. So as people are digitizing and planning out their dam, their berms and things like that, and in this case a 2-foot dike wall, it's actually using Arcade to look at the length of the feature, calculate information on the fly so that we know how many sandbags are needed. And so it's, this is a pretty typical estimation. And so you see over here, we're getting a little more complicated. But we've created a function here called sandbags needed so that it's easy to call and use down here. So we're basically saying, hey, get the finished height, which is the value entered by the user, get the sandbag type, and the length of the feature. If you were doing this on over really long areas, you might want to use length geodetic just to account for some of the distortion associated with projections like Web Mercator. But yeah, so it's doing some really neat stuff on the fly, and so on the fly calculations, none of that information is stored in the database, and it really doesn't need to be. It's really important that that's live and computed on the fly. It's lightweight. So just another interesting use case of Arcade where we're injecting information without actually having to store it at the pop-up time. So this can be used as a planning tool and an estimation tool. Now, if you did want that information in the data set, maybe you want to export an entire table and have all those values populated, you could add some fields to the data set and then run the exact same Arcade expression through field calc and get those results. All right, I'm going to hop over to another example. I think this one's pretty fun. So there's a few things going on here. So this is a clustering map, and we've got, oops, sorry, I forgot to select my layer. So we've got clustering enabled on this layer. It's using a clustering pop-up. And up until now, I've showed you all my pop-up examples. I'm going to flip over to labels, and there's actually something, oops, let me go to clustering labels are stored elsewhere. So I've got labels, and you'll notice I've got two label classes here is actually what this is. So I've defined two label classes. Those of you from the desktop world will probably understand what I mean there, but basically it allows two sets of labels with different conditions to render. So this is something that's new and supported in the Map Viewer beta. So you can take advantage of it. It is not supported in all of the legacy 3x JavaScript apps, so just be aware of that, but it allows for some useful visualization. So right now, I've got number of features and cluster type. So if I look at the number of features, that's actually being labeled right now because I'm within the scale range. This particular one isn't. So if I zoom in a little bit, I'm going to start to get, I should get two labels here really soon. So there we go. These labels themselves are being driven by Arcade. So if we looked at number of features, we're getting the cluster count as a global variable for the cluster feature. And what we're doing on the fly here, and this can be modified, is just binning these into more legible numbers so that as the numbers get bigger, your labels don't get longer and longer. So we're looking at the length of the number and then just adjusting the units of measure abbreviations as required. And then the cluster type fuel is actually looking at the predominant fuel type. And so it's actually just looking at all the unique values and calculating the predominant type, and that should match the rendering as well. So it's just a way to kind of strengthen that visual and show that, yeah, this is gas, this is hydro, this is solar, and so on. All right, so let's just take a quick look at a few more examples that I think you'll find interesting. Next up, we've got the pop-up again, and what I've got here is a tree data set for Oregon. So it's an urban tree data set. It's got a variety of information. I'm going to click on one of these trees really quick so we can see what the pop-up looks like. There's a lot in this pop-up, so let's just take a quick look at the anatomy of it to help understand what's going on here. So we've got a number of different content blocks here. So we've got some rich text, we've got multiple sets of media, which is our charts. We've got more text, we've got a gallery of attachments if they're present, and a little bit of finalized text and some detailed information. So if we scroll down, we'll see all of those things. So we've got our charts, we've got a little bit of text here to say, hey, there's more going on in the pop-up, keep scrolling. Then we've got our attachments. You'll notice that in gallery mode, we're showing those image attachments as full width. And then we've got a little bit of a header section here, and then we go into the really specific detailed information. So a lot going on in the pop-up, and what does this have to do with Arcade? So the Arcade bit here that I think is quite interesting is that we're using Arcade to drive the charts. And so let's pick one. And so this is a Arcade expression, and it's how do trees compare to our neighbor. So it looks at the existing tree with its surrounding neighbors. So if we go into our expressions, let's take the Arcade editor, open it up, and you'll see that we don't have a huge huge expression, but it's using feature sets in this particular case. And I'll just walk through the quick few lines here. So we've got our tree buffer. The first thing we do is we take our feature, we're going to buffer it by 100 feet. So create a polygon, buffer it 100 feet, and then what we're going to do is intersect that tree buffer with $layer, which is our trees layer. So what we're going to do is select every tree within 100 meters buffer of that feature we've clicked on. And then all we're doing is intersecting it. We're going to round it to tidy it up. And the main part here is we're going to get the average tree height within that buffer. And so what we're left with when we hit test here is a number. And so 15.3 feet is the average tree height in that surrounding area. And what that allows us to do is we can feed it into the chart with both the current tree height and the average tree height. And we can do a simple comparison. So as you click and go about looking at each individual tree, we can see its height relative to all of its neighbors. And we can do the same for diameter as well. So we can look at the diameter and we can see that, on average, this is a wider tree than the surrounding trees in its neighborhood. So Arcade's not just for returning static text. You can use that to create other data-driven visualizations like charts. And the very last thing that I have for you is a quick overview of some of the new stuff that's coming in with the editing forms and different logic there. So if you're not familiar with this app, this is actually the Field Maps app. And this is where you can edit and author forms today. We are going to bring that experience into ArcGIS Online in general in the near future. So what I've got here is I've got a damage assessment. I can edit my templates here. But if I go over to the form, you can see that I've got a number of things going on here. So this is a group, and I've got contact details here. I've grouped that together. I've got property details, so the liked things are all grouped together. And if I go all the way down to the bottom here, under additional comments, we've actually enabled conditional visibility. And so what does that really mean? It means that this element is only visible under certain conditions. So if we actually open this up and take a look, let's try and find out what condition it's active under. So in this particular example, we've got, we're looking at the primary cause of damage, which is prime cause here. So we're looking at the field, and we're going to say if the domain name, the name of the domain is primary cause equals other, then we return true, as in it's visible. Otherwise, we return false, which means we hide it. And we can see that in action in the Map Viewer beta. If we go here and we start editing, so let's add a new feature. Let's go down to our residential buildings. We'll say that there's minor damage. And as we bring up the form, you'll see that we've got our groupings that we saw over in the damage assessment feature form that we were editing. And if I go down to the section on damage assessment, you'll see we've got extent of damage, minor, the primary cause is empty. If we say earthquake, we don't get additional comments. But if I switch to other, all of a sudden I can fill this in. And I can say, a moose charged the front door. And provide that additional context. So you can use that data-driven logic to help make your form a little bit smarter. We're going to start expanding in this area as well. So in addition to just visibility, you'll be able to define dynamic requirements. So as you fill in something, something has to be filled in before proceeding to the next, or before adding the feature or editing or updating. Another area that we'll see some growth is while attribute rules exist in the geodatabase today, they don't work in ArcGIS Online. We're going to start to see that come into play, and those will provide some underlying business logic to the form as well and additional validation. So I think this is an area you're going to see Arcade grow a whole lot and really give you fine-grained control over how you want that editing experience to work for your users. That's all I've got for demos. I'm going to touch a little bit more on what to do when things go wrong. So I'm a planner. I like to plan things out before I get started. So I will typically just sketch mentally what I want to do in words before I get started for the more complicated expressions. So I'd encourage you to do the same. Just plan it out. Think about that logic and the flow of kind of what you want to do beforehand, and it'll just make your life a little bit easier. The test feature is something that's often overlooked. I think really helps you kind of debug. So you can change the values in your test feature to, hit different conditional logic, make sure everything is going okay. Another piece of information that's kind of often overlooked is being able to log things out to the console. So there's a console function that allows you to dump things out to the console window in the Arcade editor, and that lets you inspect, variables and figure out which code blocks you're hitting as you get more complex expressions. I will say we are doing a lot of work around making debugging this easier. So we're in the process of, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but we are working on rewriting the Arcade editor, the code editor itself. And one of the things that we're really hoping to shoot for eventually is being able to have like a step-through logic like most traditional IDEs. So we're working on that, and that'll help even more here. You saw in the sandbags expression, code that you're likely to reuse multiple times, really factor that out into its own function. It'll help with debugging, it'll help with readability, and it'll help if you want to change the logic. You only have to update it in one spot. And this is getting a little geeky, but we're at the Developer Summit, so why not? One of the things that I would encourage you to do is as you write your expressions, really pay attention to the debugger console in the browser and look at your network traffic. You'll get a really good sense there of how many queries are being sent, what the size of those queries are to achieve your expression. One of the things with feature sets is they can pile up. So if you're using them heavily, you may find that the performance suffers, right? The more data you request, the slower things get. So some strategies there are, when you're doing queries, if you can achieve your results with an attribute query instead of a spatial query, do it. Each expression executes independently of one another. So if you combine information together into a single expression, things have the potential to execute fewer times. And the biggest one, if you don't need it, don't request it. So when you're getting something like a feature set, only request the fields that you need. And that'll save you a lot of traffic on big data sets particularly. And this is a little bit in the weeds, but feature sets are evaluated lazily, so they don't send the query until such time as it actually needs to. So you have the ability to chain things together, and what I mean by that is you could define a feature set, apply a filter, and then intersect it. And that all gets executed as one query as long as nothing's done in between to use each one of those variables. So keep that in mind so you can cut down the traffic as needed. Sorry, I got a bit of cold here. So in terms of what's next, I touched on it before. We are working on an Arcade editor, a newer Arcade editor. I think it'll be really exciting. In terms of functions and kind of Arcade, the language itself, we want to be able to make it easier for our international customers to adjust things based on locale or return information in a specific locale potentially. So we're adding more functions there. We, for folks that don't know, attachments have some additional metadata that we don't make a heavily use of now, but it actually stores, for your images, it'll store the EXIF data. We want to make that accessible via Arcade, so you could do things like, highlight the direction of a photo from the EXIF metadata, or say, hey, this photo was taken from an iPhone, things like that. So being able to get into that EXIF data and pull out useful information. Another area we're doing more of, this is particularly for attribute rules, is being able to expose more direction and azimuth functions. Those are really important in different workflows, so we're working towards those. And I touched on this really before, but a big part of the hosted feature layer work is really getting full support for attribute rules at the hosted service level, which is really exciting. And I'm getting to the end here, but when you get stuck, where do you go? And so this is a useful page that Lisa has put together. there's a URL up here where you can access the PDF, so you don't have to, scramble and try and find it. So this gives you a number of links to our blogs, some story maps, our documentation. We've got a GitHub repo that has some interesting examples. I think I'll just make a note on the GitHub repo while there's some stuff there. We are working at a way to kind of bring more of that into ArcGIS Online directly. So that's another area I probably could have hinted at in what's next, is that we would like it to make it easier to reuse functions across different layers, different maps, different apps. And so we're experimenting with ways that you can kind of do that. And with that, I think that's pretty much it for today. Hope everyone had a good time. Hope everyone learned something new. And if you have questions about this, come find us in the showcase chat, and we'll be happy to help you guys. Thanks. And don't forget to fill out the survey at the bottom of this session. So thanks again. Take care.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Now is the live Q&A portion of this presentation. We got a lot of questions, a lot of great questions. And we got a lot about changing projections in Arcade. Paul, would you mind taking a stab at that?
Yeah, we got, like Lauren said, we had a few variations on the same general question, and I think it really comes down to, can I reproject data in Arcade on the fly, or can I return information in a specific projection? Today, the data is returned, like when working with the data, is returned in the projection of the map. We do want to expand that in the future. There's just some engineering challenges that we need to solve to do that really well in the web. So hopefully we can kind of relax that in the future and give you a little more control to return kind of coordinates specifically in areas and more meaningful projections that makes sense for those values. So I'd say stay tuned for that. We're working on it, but it'll probably won't be in the next release or two.
Great. We also got a lot of questions relating to attribute rules. So if you could stab at the future for attribute rules in Arcade.
Sure. For those who aren't familiar with attribute rules, it's a concept in the geodatabase today where you can use Arcade to do rule-based editing. So you can do things like automatically calculate new fields when different editing events fire, like add, update, delete. Or you can leverage validation rules. So you could say, field A plus field B plus field C can't equal more than 100 or something like that. So you can enforce this kind of validation. That exists in the geodatabase today and is supported in some enterprise non-hosted feature services. That general functionality will kind of trickle out into all of the feature services eventually. So in online, that hosted feature service should support that at probably towards the end of the year or early next year is my best guess. But you'll be able to author those attribute rules and have these data-driven expressions that help you improve data quality and validation. If you're familiar with the Field Maps app, you'll be exposed to kind of our new form editing experience. And I think you could also expect to have similar style rules that are kind of softer and exist kind of just for the purposes of that map versus all the way back to the underlying data model. So you've got some flexibility there once we bring that in, but it is coming. We recognize that it's important. So yeah, stay tuned.
Great. And our most popular question is, will the test function provide more feedback, i.e. What specifically is the error?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think I kind of mentioned in a talk, we're in the process of kind of re-envisioning the underlying script editor for Arcade. And a big part of that centers around having more feedback while you're writing the expression. And one of our goals there is to actually, the test feature will always exist in some manner or another, but say when you're authoring a pop-up and you've got the Arcade editor up, we don't want to take you away from the map. And so you can have the pop-up up while you're writing that expression and get instant feedback as you compile that expression. You can hop around on your map and pick a different feature. And we are trying to figure out, there are some questions about things like feature sets and kind of having more visibility into the data that's coming back from that query that you send off. So all of those things we're kind of exploring and trying to find creative ways to bring into the new editor experience so that you guys have more cues, more hints when things don't turn out exactly as you planned, like every script out there at some point. So yeah, we're hoping to get that out sometime this year, and I think it will bring a lot of really neat features on top of that, as well as things like IntelliSense, and hopefully having some insertable examples too for common tasks. I think someone had asked about accessing related tables. So, being able to auto insert a snippet that helps facilitate that is kind of one of the goals we have there too. So big goals, but yeah, we're trying to give you some better tools to do some interesting things.
Right. Another popular question was, can expression return multiple values like in a dictionary and access them individually by key?
So this is a really interesting one that I guess you could ask it a lot about the future arcade. One thing that we're doing in the pop-up specifically right now from a research project is looking at how we can return entire content blocks in the pop-up as an arcade expression. And that goal will let you do things like that, return a dictionary and essentially get a list of fields. And so you could return a text element or completely drive a chart from scratch through a single arcade expression. And so one of the goals there is that it saves you having to write multiple expressions to achieve a single result, which results in extra queries, which bogs down your pop-up if you're using feature sets or like heavily. And so being able to do that whole thing in a single expression, I think will be really nice and give you guys a lot of control. You can see some of the kind of similar ideas, like the dashboard. The new dashboard has some very similar concepts like that inside of the dashboard. So yeah, look to those to come to the pop-up. And I think I'll grab the one about the attachments as well. In doing doing that work, you'll also be able to have more control over the attachment element. For example, you could say, I only want the images back from the attachments and show them here. And then you could separate out maybe your PDFs, your as-built drawings or something like that into a different section. So being able to kind of tailor those results through Arcade gives a lot of control over kind of inserting things where they make sense and filtering out that generic bucket of attachments.
Great. And then there's another question. Can we use the calculated field as a web map search field?
Today, no. I think when attributes come into play, you'll be able to auto calculate that field dynamically and then leverage that. So I think you'll have a way to achieve the same thing, but I don't know that we'll be exposing the ability to kind of just create a virtual value on the fly and search for that, but across multiple fields, because it's unlikely to be performant in the database. But with attribute rules, you could actually have that field in the underlying data set that concatenates that whenever the data changes, so it's always up to date, and then you could just leverage that individual field.
Lisa brought a question up. Are there limitations to labeling using Arcade in the classic map viewer? For example, I know the new line expressions only worked in beta.
Is that for me or Lisa?
Yeah.
Lisa
think, brought it up.
I think Paul can probably answer it best. My understanding that this is a difference between 3x and 4x of JavaScript. Maybe Paul can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the simple label expressions should be transferable, but the newer map viewer has the concept of multiple label classes, and those will not carry backwards compatible, are not backwards compatible. really all the new and exciting stuff in the map viewer and the newer APIs is really gives you a lot of control with labeling. So you'll be able to do things like multi-line labeling through Arcade, multiple label classes that draw at different scales, and so all of that stuff is not backwards compatible with the old map viewer or the classic map viewer.
I feel like I'm really bothering Paul. How do you manage / organize the expressions you write, for instance, to share with others or generally reuse?
It's a really good question. This is an area that I think you'll see something come out later on this year that make it a little bit easier. We've been looking at kind of and getting feedback from you folks as users to try and figure out what makes sense. There's some times where in the context of a map, it's handy to kind of be able to reuse those expressions because they share the same logic. A good example of that is the new data collection form. Maybe you have several fields that hide and show based on a specific condition. Rather than having to maintain one expression per field in that data collection form, you could use a single expression in the context of that form and reference it multiple times. So in certain areas of the kind of underlying, like where we use Arcade, you'll see the ability to reuse those come into play. But also we are trying to just, I guess, firm up how we want to make it easier to share Arcade expressions. So many of you write Arcade expressions that are relevant across multiple data sets, and having a central place to see those, and more importantly, discover them when you're writing new expressions or working on new maps is important. And we're gonna try and bring that concept in. I think my sense is that it'll probably be a new item type where you can actually have a expression library, and you can store different expressions across multiple items and then import them as needed. But we're still fleshing out the finer points of how that all works.
Sorry, just looking for a question.
Should we, I guess, while Lauren's looking, I guess
We covered
one
quite a
question,
few.
we have covered a lot. And there's, if you guys asked a question and we didn't answer it, please stop by the Ask the Experts area and we'll try and answer it. But there's a good one in there, I think, about just general compatibility, about whether or not expressions work in the map viewer classic and the new map viewer the same way. And they generally should. There really isn't a difference between what's supported in map viewer classic and map viewer beta from the Arcade language perspective. So if something works in the classic and it doesn't work in the map viewer beta, I would expect that to be a bug. So if you found a bug, come find me and I'll see if we can get it fixed.
Is it possible to sum up the total attribute value for a series of records in a hosted feature layer located in a web map and build an attribute expression?
Lisa, do you want to take that one or me?
I was going to say, I can give it my best shot, and if I'm wrong, Paul can correct me. But what I would do is you could use a feature set to summarize the values, or what is it? Oh my gosh, there's a new function, and Paul is going to laugh at me for not knowing it off the top of my head. But I would use a feature set and cycle through those. But you can't use a feature set within symbology, so that's just something to keep in mind, I think, for that question.
If your data was structured in a way too that like each individual like field was its own value, you wanted to sum up just the fields within that feature, you can still do that just with a simple like plus, just add them together and return it as well. So yeah, depending on what the use case is, you've got options available. And like Lisa said, if you do need to use feature sets, we don't support those in symbology, but quite often, assuming that your data isn't regularly changing, you can use the field calculate to calculate a new field based on an Arcade expression, and that should perform fairly well. It's not as fast or as robust as SQL, but if your data set isn't if it isn't large and complicated, it should generally work very well. But yeah, it does have some practical limits because it has to fetch everything and calculate it client side, but we're working on optimizing that so we can support larger data sets in the future.
All right, I think that wraps up our time. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this session, and to encourage you to fill out the survey that's below the video there. It'll help us for future sessions. And if we didn't answer any of your questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us in the Ask Our Experts, directly message us. Yeah, thanks again.